A black man was peacefully sleeping during a flight until the pilot screamed, "We need a fighter pilot now." What happened next revealed a shocking twist at 30,000 feet. He was dozing peacefully mid-flight, never revealing who he truly was. Subscribe if you believe heroes can appear when least expected. The cabin hadn't descended into chaos yet, but murmurs moved like a current, panicked, fast, unstoppable. Victor hadn't meant for the truth to get out, but it had, and now the illusion of safety was gone. He stared at the radar again. The Galdrick's jets inched closer. Their formation tightened, boxing the plane in. Jerome swallowed hard. What do we do? Victor didn't answer right away. The cockpit was filled with flashing lights, the quiet hum of dread, and a single burning thought. They were alone, outgunned, trapped in enemy skies. Somewhere behind them, passengers whispered about the man in row 14. Someone said his name out loud. Someone else said, "Skyborn." But Victor didn't hear that. He was still staring at the jets, at the blinking lock-on alert, at the radar. His voice from minutes ago echoed in his mind, cursed and irreversible. The calm facade shattered with one slip of the tongue. Gasps filled the cabin like a sudden gust of wind. The passengers froze for a beat, their minds scrambling to make sense of what they'd just heard through the intercom. The word "fighter pilot" hung in the air, sharp and terrifying. A woman in seat 17C clutched her husband's arm with trembling fingers. 2 rows ahead, a man glanced anxiously at the window, where a flicker of silver moved in the distance. The low murmur of conversation surged into panicked whispers. "Did he say fighter pilot?" someone said aloud, almost in disbelief. "He did," another replied, his voice thin with dread. "What does that mean?" "Are we being attacked?" The cabin crew sprang into action, attempting to calm the growing unrest. Flight attendants moved down the aisles, smiling tightly, insisting it was just a miscommunication from the cockpit. But the forced calm in their voices only made things worse. People weren't stupid. Not when shadows with wings were beginning to appear outside their windows, cutting through the clouds like knives. Through the narrow glass, the unmistakable outline of sleek fighter jets now flanked the passenger plane, gliding with mechanical precision. The foreign aircraft moved in perfect synchronization, close enough that their sharp fins and dark insignia became visible. There was no mistaking it. They were being followed. In the cockpit, Captain Victor Ruth sat rigid, his face pale as the gravity of his mistake sank in. He hadn't meant for the intercom to carry his words into the cabin. "We need a fighter pilot," he had whispered, almost to himself. But the button had been pressed. The whole plane had heard him. He glanced sideways at his co-pilot, Jerome Castor, who stared wide-eyed at the radar. "We can't fly out of this," Victor muttered. "We can't even turn." "They're closing formation," Jerome said, his fingers tightening around the edge of the console. "We're not just being watched. They're forcing us." Back in the cabin, panic had reached a quiet, dangerous simmer. A middle-aged man in the rear stood suddenly, his voice cracking as he shouted over the hum of fear. "He's right," he called out, motioning toward the front of the plane. "We're doomed unless someone here knows how to fly like them." The attendants rushed to hush him, one placing a firm hand on his chest, another waving for him to sit. "Sir, please, calm down. Do not incite." But the spark had been lit. All around him, passengers turned to each other. Their faces were pale, eyes wide with unspoken dread. A child whimpered, clutching a small plush toy as his father wrapped him tightly in an arm. In seat 19A, a man fumbled with his phone, searching for a signal that wasn't there. The plane was still flying, still pressurized and intact, but something had changed. The illusion of safety was gone. Near the center of the plane, a figure stirred. Darius Kane opened his eyes slowly. His gaze didn't dart around in panic like the others. It focused, sharp and steady, as if he were listening to something beyond the physical, an instinct, a signal only he could sense. He sat up with quiet purpose, brushing the thin airline blanket off his lap. The toy plane his niece had dropped earlier rested near his foot, tipped on its side like a tiny fallen soldier. He reached down, turned it upright, then stood. The act was unremarkable on the surface, just a man standing up in a plane. But the energy shifted. People near him turned. Some didn't know why they stared. Maybe it was the calm in his movements, the strength in his posture, or the way he seemed to cut through the noise without raising his voice. His shoulders squared as he stepped into the aisle, his frame tall and deliberate. From the row behind him, a voice whispered, "Wait, that's Darius Kane." It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. The name moved like a current down the aisle. Someone else echoed it. Then another. "Kane? From Skyborne. I read about him. He was in the defense fleet." The recognition spread. Eyes widened. A few passengers leaned out of their seats for a better look. Others simply froze. The stories had lived in defense forums and online documentaries. Tales of a pilot who flew through impossible odds, who had vanished from service without fanfare. A legend buried in silence. Darius exhaled through his nose. He had wanted peace. After years in the air, after battles that left scars beneath his skin, he had walked away from all of it. But now the past was crawling back, not in memory, but in real time. The enemy wasn't a rumor. It was outside the window, flying in formation, and it had forced the skies open. He began walking. The aisle was narrow, but each step felt like a widening path between what he had left behind and what waited ahead. The whispers grew into soft murmurs, reverent and afraid. A teenage boy in 16C looked up at him in awe. "Are you really? The Falcon?" Darius didn't answer. His eyes were locked ahead, his pace even, as if every motion had already been calculated. Passengers parted for him instinctively like waves before a prow. At the front, one of the younger attendants looked up and froze. Sir, he stammered. Darius simply nodded. "I need to speak to the captain." The attendant glanced toward the cockpit, hesitant, but something in Darius's voice, calm, firm, resolute, left no room for refusal. He opened the door. Inside, Victor looked up, startled. "You," Darius met his eyes, "you asked for a fighter pilot." Victor stared, unable to speak for a moment. His breath caught, and he whispered, "Are you him? Are you Kane from Skyborne?" Darius nodded slightly, jaw tightening. Behind him, the cabin watched in hushed silence. Even those who didn't fully understand what was happening sensed that the moment had shifted, that the trembling uncertainty of the last few minutes had turned into something else, something anchored in the presence of one man who now stood at the doorway to the cockpit. Somewhere above them, the foreign jets banked slowly, their silhouettes circling like vultures in the mist. Darius reached for the cockpit headset handed to him by a stunned Jerome. The moment it settled over his ears, a crackling voice hissed through. "Kane," it said, laced with venomous familiarity, "we know you're there. This sky is ours." Now Darius's expression didn't change, but a shadow passed through his eyes. The voice wasn't random. It was personal, and he knew exactly who it belonged to. Sometimes destiny doesn't knock, it shakes you awake. When Darius stepped into the narrow aisle of the aircraft, all eyes turned. The low buzz of frightened whispers stilled, replaced by thick silence that pressed against the cabin walls. The overhead lights flickered as another tremor rocked the plane, this one not from turbulence, but from tension. Darius walked steadily toward the cockpit, each footfall purposeful, his shoulders squared like a man already carrying the weight of every soul on board. The cockpit door hung open, revealing Captain Victor Ruth gripping the control yoke with white knuckles. His eyes met Darius's, steady, unreadable, and for a brief second, time paused. The hum of the engines, the murmurs of the passengers, the occasional chime of a call light, all of it faded beneath the weight of one question. "Are you him?" Victor's voice was hoarse, brittle with stress. "Are you Kane from Skyborne?" Darius didn't blink. He gave a single nod, jaw tightening, eyes locked with Victor's like steel on steel. Behind the captain, co-pilot Jerome Castor flinched as if a gust of wind had blown through the cabin. "No way," he whispered, half in disbelief, half in desperate hope. The name had become legend among military flight crews. Falcon, they used to call him, the kind of pilot who made impossible maneuvers look routine until he disappeared from the skies. Victor hesitated only a moment longer, glancing at the blinking radar that showed the twin blips of danger tailing them too close for comfort. His hand hovered over the autopilot switch. Regulations screamed against what he was about to do. Civilian protocols forbade passengers, any passenger, from taking control of the aircraft. But missiles didn't care about regulations. "If you're willing," Victor said quietly, his voice tight with urgency, "we'll need you now." Darius's stare didn't waver. He took one step forward, looking past the cockpit glass at the darkening sky. "I didn't come here to fly," he said, voice low. but I won't sit by while this plane falls from it." Victor stood, unfastening his harness and sliding out of the pilot's seat with a trembling breath. Jerome adjusted his headset, moving aside slightly to make room. Darius slid into the left seat with calm precision, hands brushing across controls that still felt like home. The instrument panel lit up beneath his fingertips, a familiar language he hadn't spoken in years. But it was coming back, fast. Then came the jolt of panic. Outside the left windows, sharp flashes blinked in formation. 2 enemy fighters flared red, then dipped in unison, cutting directly in front of the commercial airliner. Lights on their undersides blinked in rhythm, signals demanding compliance. The Galdrick's jets were no longer bluffing. They wanted this aircraft diverted, or worse. Inside the cabin, gasps erupted. A child's voice cried out from the middle rows. "Daddy, what's that?" A father's voice, thick with fear, tried to hush him. Window shades were pulled up. Some passengers pressed their faces against the glass, watching the nightmare unfold in real time. Victor's hand hovered over the intercom switch. "Do we tell them?" Darius shook his head. "Not yet. Keep the cabin calm." Then an attendant stepped forward and handed Darius a spare headset. He slipped it on, adjusting the mic with practiced fingers. The cockpit filled with static, white noise, fragmented voices, and electronic pulses. Jerome tried to re-establish connection with the transponder, but the signal scrambled. Suddenly, through the crackle, a voice emerged. "Kane." It wasn't a call sign. It wasn't a hail. It was a name, spoken with familiarity, spoken with purpose. "We know you're there." Darius froze. The voice wasn't robotic or distorted by distance. It was clear, almost smug, like a predator circling prey it had tracked for miles. The air in the cockpit seemed to freeze. "This sky is ours now." The message wasn't an alert. It was a declaration. Jerome looked over, alarm rising in his eyes. "They're talking directly to you." How do they know? But Darius already knew the answer. His hands curled into fists around the yoke, the muscles in his forearms tightening beneath the sleeves of his shirt. His chest rose and fell in controlled breaths as memories he'd buried deep clawed their way back into the cockpit. Whoever was flying those enemy jets wasn't just responding to radar. They had come for him. Victor glanced at the radar. The blips were closer now, tighter. "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means this isn't a warning," Darius said quietly. "It's a message." He looked through the glass at the dark streaks of steel slicing through the clouds. Somewhere out there, in one of those cockpits, was a man who knew his name, a man who hadn't forgotten the last time they met in the sky. The silence thickened, broken only by the hiss of the radio and the rising alarm from the radar system. Victor reached for the logbook, checking their last transmission. "They had to know in advance you'd be on this flight." This isn't coincidence. Darius's voice was even, but a storm brewed behind his eyes. Then someone wanted this to happen? The implication chilled the cockpit. As the Galdrick's jets tightened their formation, circling in an increasingly aggressive pattern, Darius's mind sharpened. Every angle, every possible maneuver began calculating in his head, not for attack, but for survival. He glanced at the fuel gauges, engine strain indicators, altitude metrics. His mind shifted from fear to resolve. Jerome swallowed hard. "What now?" Darius adjusted the headset. "Now? Now I get them to focus on me, just like they planned. But they won't like what they find." And in the back of his mind, he knew this was only the beginning. The radio crackled again, and the voice returned with a low laugh, as if savoring the moment. "We warned you, Kane. But you still flew into our skies." Darius leaned slightly forward, eyes narrowing, fingers brushing against the throttle. This wasn't a routine flight anymore. This was war, thinly veiled as patrol, and it had just turned personal. The enemy already knew who he was. The cockpit erupted in a storm of flashing warnings and relentless beeps, the air inside tight with static and tension. A chilling voice hissed through the headset, distorting slightly but unmistakable in its taunt. "Kane, we know you're there. The sky is ours now." Darius froze, eyes narrowing as the voice struck something deep inside him. He recognized the tone instantly. Calm, smug, ruthless. Commander Brannock. The name twisted like iron in his gut. Years ago, they had clashed in the skies above the Kerith Divide, both elite pilots of rival air forces, both legends in their own right. Darius had won that day, but Brannock had vanished into the fog of war, presumed dead or dishonorably discharged. Clearly, he was neither. Jerome turned toward Darius, pale beneath the dim emergency lighting. "They know it's you." "This isn't random," he whispered, dread soaking through every word. "Somebody leaked your presence." Darius didn't reply. He leaned forward, gripping the console as if to steady himself against the weight of what he now understood. This wasn't a patrol. It wasn't intimidation. This was a hunt. A roar echoed outside the window as one of the Galdrex fighter jets streaked past, its underbelly lined with weapons not meant for display. Victor reached behind him and grabbed Darius's shoulder, his voice low and urgent. "Can you handle this?" he asked, searching Darius's face for something. Certainty, maybe, or courage. Darius didn't hesitate. He gave a small, grim smile, the kind that came from remembering not just how to fight, but why. "I can handle him," he said, voice level. "But this time, the stakes are higher." The cockpit trembled slightly as the enemy jets locked on with their targeting systems. The plane's defense alerts shrieked louder. Red lights pulsed across the panels like a heartbeat nearing cardiac arrest. Outside the cabin, passengers clung to one another as turbulence shook the aircraft violently. An overhead bin popped open, scattering someone's belongings into the aisle. Screams echoed, not just from fear, but from helplessness. Fathers held sons tighter. A businessman muttered prayers into his hands. But inside the cockpit, Darius blocked out the chaos. He moved with precision, sliding into the left seat, brushing aside the weight of years that had passed since he last sat in command of a craft under threat. He adjusted the headset, his fingers gliding instinctively over controls, eyes scanning every display like he had never left. The commercial jet was no fighter, its bulk slow, its wings wide, its engines built for distance, not dogfights, but Darius wasn't trying to win a war. He was trying to outlast a storm. He glanced at the engine status, ran the numbers for fuel distribution, calculated drag under the current weight. Every breath he took seemed to pull him deeper into the version of himself he had buried long ago, the version that didn't hesitate. Outside the cockpit, Brannock's jet circled wide, his shadow crossing over the fuselage like a predator in flight. "Let's see if your hands still remember," came the voice again, colder now. "Let's see if Falcon still flies." Darius didn't reply. He reached up and flipped a manual override for the rudder pressure system, compensating for the commercial craft's slow response time. Then he tapped Victor's comm panel. "Tell the cabin crew to secure all passengers. No one moves from this point forward. Lock the aisles. Pull down all masks. Brace positions." Victor blinked. "You're really going to do this?" "I already am," Darius said, flipping another series of switches. "Now lock the cockpit. If I fail, they'll need time to prepare for impact." Jerome swallowed hard and began initiating cabin lockdown protocols, his fingers trembling but moving fast. The door sealed behind them with a solid clunk. The plane jerked again, more turbulence, or maybe something more. Darius angled the nose slightly down, gaining a pocket of denser air to stabilize the altitude. The move was subtle but deliberate. A test. And Brannock responded. A streak of white smoke crossed their path, a warning flare fired just off the wing. Close enough to see. Close enough to scare. Screams echoed from the cabin again as passengers saw the light explode outside the window. The sudden glare burned through the fogged-up glass, painting panic on every face. "They're toying with us," Victor muttered, gripping his seat. "No," Darius said quietly, tightening his grip on the yoke. "They're testing us. They want to see if I'm still in here." With one swift motion, he banked the plane slightly left, pushing its limits without breaching control. The wings groaned, but held. He corrected with a rightward tilt, managing the jet's inertia with perfect timing. "You're flying a building through the sky," Jerome whispered. "No," Darius said, eyes locked on the enemy blips tightening around them. "I'm flying a promise." Outside, Brannock's craft pulled up alongside the cockpit window, just close enough that the insignia on his fuselage became visible, a talon clenched over a bolt of black lightning. Victor saw it too and stiffened. That's his mark, isn't it?" Darius nodded slowly. The memory of that symbol had haunted his sleep for years. "It was never just military with him. He made it personal when I survived, and he didn't." Victor's voice was barely audible. "What happens now?" Darius exhaled, eyes sharp, mind clearer than it had been in years. Now, I do what I was trained to do. Not for glory, not for medals, but because 342 lives are counting on me not to flinch. The cockpit lights pulsed again. Another radar lock, but Darius didn't blink. He leaned forward, adjusted the flaps slightly, and whispered to no one in particular, "Let's see if you still fly, Brannock." He pulled the throttle forward. The jet responded with a low growl. The fight wasn't only about a flight, it was about unfinished history. The cabin shuddered as a searing flash of light streaked past the left wing. A flare, hot, brilliant, and far too close, cut through the sky like a warning shot from the heavens. Inside the cockpit, Darius Kane didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto the HUD, fingers tightening around the yoke as warning signals blinked like sirens on the dash. Victor Ruth let out a quiet gasp behind him. "That flare came within 10 feet, he said, voice gravelly, full of restrained panic. "They're testing us," Darius replied, low and steady. His voice held no fear, only calculation. He didn't need to look out the window to know the Galdrick's fighters were maneuvering again. He felt it, felt the pressure they were applying, the intimidation tactics, the psychological warfare. This wasn't just about military dominance. It was a game of nerves, of proving who would blink first. A quick series of keystrokes sent a message to the crew. "Seal the cabin," he said firmly. "No one enters or leaves, and reroute all communication to secondary encrypted relays. If they're tracking our channels, I don't want them hearing anything else." Victor moved without hesitation. "Understood." Jerome Castor, seated to the right, already had his hands on the auxiliary comms, initiating the override sequence. Outside, the sky narrowed with tension. 2 Galdrick's fighters flanked the airliner, silent predators with angled wings and sleek bodies glinting under the sun. One pulled dangerously close, flying parallel just beyond the cockpit glass. And then the voice came again. "I've waited for this, Kane." Brannock's voice crackled through the headset, more distorted than before, but unmistakably cold. "Let's see if your hands still remember." Darius didn't answer. He simply adjusted altitude, dipping the nose 30 feet. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to gain airflow efficiency and control. The jet creaked in protest, not built for this kind of manipulation, but it held. His grip on the yoke was firm, purposeful. Jerome looked over, eyes wide. "You're flying her like it's a skyborne fighter." "I'm flying her like she's the only thing standing between 342 civilians and a coffin," Darius said. Another flicker of movement outside. The lead Galdrick's fighter looped around, its underbelly momentarily visible through the cabin windows. Passengers screamed. From the air, the flash of the insignia was unmistakable, a black lightning bolt beneath an eagle's talon. Brannock Darius exhaled, his expression unchanged. "This isn't a routine interception," he said. "They know I'm here." "This is personal." Victor's brow furrowed. "Personal?" "I know the man flying that jet, and he knows me." The implications hung heavy in the cockpit. This wasn't just an international incident. It was an ambush, disguised as protocol, and it had been waiting for Darius. Outside, Brannock's jet swept back into position, this time closer. The nose almost aligned with the airliner's wing, a show of control, intimidation, mockery. "Tell me, Kane," Brannock's voice returned, smooth and venomous. "What's it like flying a metal whale instead of a blade?" Darius still didn't respond. His hands made minute corrections, keeping the airliner stable despite the pressure. His mind was moving faster than his controls, calculating climb angles, stall thresholds, wind drift vectors. He adjusted engine output on the right side just slightly, creating an intentional imbalance, enough to tip the plane subtly. Brannock compensated, shifting slightly to maintain position. That was the test. Darius had control, and Brannock knew it. The jolt came without warning. A sudden drop, a sharp, jarring dip that made trays rattle, heads jerk upward, and coffee splash over unsuspecting laps. The overhead bins creaked, and a few startled gasps broke the low hum of Aryan Flight 672's otherwise composed cabin. Most passengers blinked in confusion, murmuring to one another as the aircraft quickly restabilized. But that brief shake had cracked the illusion of routine. Something felt off. In seat 14A, Darius Kane opened his eyes. His left hand, instinctively steady, gripped the armrest while the other slowly retrieved the toy plane that had rolled from his lap. It was a small plastic model, bright blue with silver wings, his infant niece's favorite. She wasn't with him on this trip, but the toy had come along anyway, as a quiet promise to return safely. Darius glanced around. Most of the cabin was still calm, though a few nervous eyes lingered on the overhead seatbelt light, which had flickered back on without the usual chime. The engines continued their low, rhythmic thrum beneath the floorboards, but Darius's ears tuned to something else. The silence that followed the turbulence. The kind of silence that was too rehearsed, too intentional. He straightened in his seat, shoulders squaring beneath a soft gray sweater. From his row, he could just barely see the edge of the cockpit door, slightly ajar as a flight attendant passed through. That sliver of open space revealed a glimpse of Captain Victor Ruth, brow furrowed, hand hovering near the throttle, lips pressed into a taut line. "Seatbelts, please," the captain's voice echoed through the intercom, calm but a beat too late. "Just a little turbulence." All normal. It wasn't normal, not to Darius. He'd spent too many years reading the sky, and even now, retired, quieter, a civilian, he could feel it in his gut. That drop had been precise, not random, as if the plane had hit a pressure pocket that shouldn't exist at this altitude. He exhaled slowly, fingers lightly drumming on the armrest. Across the aisle, a teenage boy noticed him. The boy stared a little too long, then whispered something to his father. Darius didn't react. He was used to that. Some still recognized him, mostly from archived news footage back when he was Falcon, the Skyborne Fleet's precision pilot and their poster soldier during the Ulnar conflict. He hadn't flown in years. He hadn't wanted to. But the sky, like memory, had its own way of pulling people back. In the cockpit, Victor Ruth wiped his forehead with the sleeve of his uniform. "How close are they?" he asked without looking. His co-pilot, Jerome Castor, hunched over the radar panel. "About 2 nautical miles. No ID tags. Military configuration." "They're matching speed," Victor's voice dropped. "Galdrex?" Jerome didn't answer immediately. His silence spoke enough. Victor muttered under his breath. "This wasn't supposed to happen." "We were told the corridor was clear." Jerome shifted uneasily. "That route changed 3 days ago. They rerouted civilian flights east. We must have missed the notice. We're flying through disputed airspace." Victor cursed softly, checking the fuel gauges. "We can't turn back now. Closest neutral airfield is Havendale, but it's a full hour ahead." "Then we keep course?" Jerome asked. Victor didn't answer. Instead, he leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the glowing dots on the screen, unmarked, unblinking, closing in. Darius watched as the same flight attendant returned down the aisle, a little too fast, his smile tight and practiced. He offered water to a passenger but never stopped walking. His steps betrayed tension. In seat 14A, Darius closed his eyes again. Not to sleep, but to focus. Old instincts stirred. He remembered the feeling of turbulence under hostile air, the weight of radar lock, the whisper of flares streaking past a cockpit, the breathless moments between command and maneuver. He didn't want this to be one of those moments. Not here. Not now. But fate had already turned the wheel. Inside the cockpit, Jerome tapped the monitor with a trembling finger. "Victor, they're fanning out." The captain's voice was flat. "They're not just watching. They're preparing." Jerome looked back at him. "What do we do?" Victor hesitated. He looked down at the control panel, then up at the sky ahead, the pale clouds streaking like soft brushstrokes against a blue canvas. Then he spoke. Not into the headset, not to Jerome, but accidentally into the open cabin intercom. "We need a fighter pilot." There was a pause, a crackling silence. Then the speaker cut out. In the cabin, heads turned. Gasps followed. One man sat up and whispered, "Did he say fighter pilot?" Another clutched the seat in front of him. "What's going on?" An older man began crossing himself. Panic had not arrived, but it had slipped through the doorway. Darius sat very still. His breathing slowed. His hands rested gently on the plastic toy in his lap. And far above, somewhere in the clouds, 2 blips continued their quiet approach, silent, unmarked, watching. This flight was not going to be routine. The intercom crackled to life just as the plane jolted from another pocket of turbulence. Captain Victor Ruth's voice, normally calm and authoritative, carried a subtle edge this time. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We're encountering mild turbulence, nothing unusual for this region. Thank you for your cooperation." The announcement ended, but inside the cockpit, things were far from routine. Sweat formed a thin sheen on Victor's brow despite the cold air circulating through the control panel vents. His hands hovered over the controls, fingers twitching with indecision. Beside him, First Officer Jerome Castor leaned forward, eyes glued to the radar screen. His fingertips tapped nervously against the glass. 2 dots, small, sharp, and steady, mirrored their flight path. Not behind, not ahead, parallel. "They're shadowing us," Jerome muttered, his voice barely audible above the hum of avionics. Victor leaned closer to the screen, his breath fogging the glass. "Those are jets." "Galdrex," Jerome confirmed, dread tightening his throat. "That's their flight signature." Victor's heart thudded in his chest. Galdrex, a neighboring state perpetually on edge with their homeland, locked in diplomatic stalemates and military posturing. Their airspace was hot, always had been. Civilian flights were never meant to enter this corridor. Victor's eyes darted to the flight route logs, then the map display. A blinking red indicator revealed the truth. A miscalculation, no, a reroute had brought them here. A bad data handoff. The plane had entered contested airspace, unauthorized and exposed. "This shouldn't be happening," Victor whispered, his knuckles white against the yoke. "We're not armed. We're not cleared. And now we're being tracked." A moment passed in silence, the weight of it crushing. Then the cockpit lit up. Blinking red lights danced across the dashboard like fireflies in a storm. A shrill alarm followed. Missile lock warning. Jerome's hand shot to the override, canceling the audible alert, but the dread remained. His voice shook. "They've locked on." "They're forcing us to land, Victor. This isn't a warning." Victor stood halfway out of his seat, scanning the window. The first Galdrex fighter came into view, sleek, black, agile. It drifted beside the civilian plane like a shadow made real. The pilot inside didn't wave, didn't signal. He just hovered, watching. Victor's mouth was dry. "We can't outfly them." "No," Jerome said. "We won't even make it 10 miles before they fire a warning shot or worse." Victor turned back to the controls, heart hammering. Passengers. Over 300 families. Children. Civilians with no idea they were seconds from becoming a news headline. His hand slammed down on the console in frustration. The words slipped out before he could stop them. "We need a fighter pilot." He meant to say it to Jerome, quietly, in desperation. But his finger had landed on the cabin intercom switch. His voice echoed through the entire aircraft. In row after row, passengers stirred. Eyes opened, heads turned, gasps erupted. Did he say fighter pilot? A businessman dropped his coffee. A teenage boy in headphones looked around in confusion. A mother clutched her baby tighter. The words struck like thunder, igniting fear. In the galley, a flight attendant froze mid-step, tray trembling in his hands. Was that real? Did the captain just say that? In row 14, a man stirred, slowly, deliberately. Darius Kane opened his eyes. His blanket slid to the floor as he sat upright, face calm but alert. Inside the cabin, the crew moved swiftly down the aisles, instructing passengers to stay seated and remain calm. Children were crying. A mother near the rear of the plane clutched her son's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. Jerome's voice cut through the noise. "Darius, he's not here to escort us out of this zone. He's here for you." "I know." Victor leaned forward. "Why now?" "Because I stopped him once. And I think he wants to erase the memory of it, right here, over a sky full of civilians. If I mess up, he doesn't even have to fire a shot. I'll do the work for him." A silence settled, broken only by the soft clicking of systems and the distant roar of wind past the hull. Then another flare burst outside the right wing, illuminating the interior with violent orange light. Screams echoed through the cabin again. Brannock was inching closer. "This ends soon," Darius said. "One way or another." Victor swallowed hard. "You think he'll fire on us?" Darius looked straight ahead, jaw tense. "He doesn't want to just down a plane. He wants me to break, to fly scared. But I don't fly scared outside." Brannock's fighter performed a sharp roll and then aligned once more, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment. "Whatever this is," Victor said, "it's not a drill." "He's daring you to respond." Darius nodded. "And I'm going to." He leaned forward slightly, made a careful adjustment to the thrust levels, then dipped the nose a second time. Lower, riskier, faster. The airliner responded with a deep groan of strain. Passengers were jolted in their seats. Overhead bins rattled. "Hang on," Darius whispered. Jerome blinked. "What are you doing?" "Changing the rules." The aircraft dropped altitude, then banked left just enough to disrupt Brannick's pattern. Brannick pulled away momentarily, forced to compensate. It wasn't much, but it was something. The two Galdrick's fighters now hovered like shadows, circling but unsure. Darius's maneuvers had caught them off guard. No one expected a passenger plane to be flown like this. Brannick's voice returned, tighter now, laced with annoyance. "Still got tricks, Kane. But this sky isn't yours anymore." A moment passed, then Jerome shouted, "Another flare, dead ahead." The flash blinded the cockpit momentarily, but Darius didn't waver. He used the sudden burst to shift again, climbing just enough to disrupt the expected trajectory. It was a dance, not between equals, but between predator and protector. Darius kept one eye on the radar, one on the sky. The stakes were no longer measured in miles or minutes, but in seconds and inches. He looked straight ahead, jaw tightening, heart pounding, but movements precise as ever. Brannick's jet returned to view, inches from the cockpit. On its side was that same mocking insignia, black lightning beneath an eagle's talon. And Darius knew then, beyond all doubt. This wasn't a military exercise anymore. It was a personal ambush disguised as an international standoff. A sudden spike on the radar made Jerome stiffen. His voice trembled as he spoke. Two more blips just appeared. Darius Kane's eyes snapped to the screen. The new signatures moved fast, too fast to be anything but military grade. Reinforcements. The enemy wasn't just taunting them anymore. Galdrick's was escalating. Darius's chest tightened, not from fear, but from the calculated pressure of time. They were 6 minutes from the edge of international airspace, a fragile line between war and protection. But with each second dragging under the weight of tension, 6 minutes felt like an eternity. "We're not going to make it if they box us in," Jerome muttered, sweat trailing down his temple. "We will," Darius replied, voice like steel. Without warning, Darius gripped the yoke and nosed the plane into a steep tactical dive, startling Victor and Jerome. The engines roared as the aircraft cut through layers of air, howling under the sudden shift. Oxygen masks dropped in the cabin with a mechanical clatter, and passengers screamed in terror. The descent was violent, controlled, but far from gentle. Trays flew, drinks spilled, luggage bins rattled, and the sound of panicked cries filled the fuselage. An elderly man collapsed in his seat, head falling forward, while a mother threw her arms around her son, shielding his head. Victor grabbed the overhead handle, bracing himself. "We're pushing stress limits," he warned, voice tight with concern. "There won't be one," Darius answered flatly, eyes sharp, hand steady. Outside the cockpit window, the hostile jets hesitated. The civilian plane had moved in a way they weren't prepared for. No passenger aircraft should be able to dive like this and maintain control. But Darius wasn't flying by commercial standards, he was flying like a skyborne pilot, and this jet was now his bird of war. A sharp vibration ran through the fuselage. Then a sudden jolt rocked the left side of the aircraft. Red lights blinked across the panel as a small explosion bloomed behind them. Close, but not a direct hit. A warning shot. The enemy had fired a controlled missile blast just near the tail. It was a message. A brutal, chilling one. "We're not done." Inside the cabin, the explosion triggered pure chaos. The passengers screamed louder. One man shouted into his phone, still trying to get a signal. A boy cried uncontrollably, his seatbelt pulled so tight it cut into his jacket. A flight attendant crawled down the aisle, yelling instructions, trying to calm anyone who would listen. But panic ruled the air. In the cockpit, Darius's expression remained unreadable. He adjusted their pitch and rolled the aircraft into a side stall, a rare maneuver known only to elite combat pilots. The wings tilted sharply. For a terrifying second, the aircraft hovered in near-stall position. Then Darius corrected with a full-thrust push, surging forward with a roar that stunned both Victor and Jerome. The airliner groaned under the strain. Loose items clattered violently. But Darius didn't flinch. The maneuver had done exactly what he intended. One of the pursuing fighters overcompensated during its reaction, banking too sharply to adjust to the unexpected shift in velocity. The jet swung wide, missing its formation slot, and was forced to reorient itself farther out. "That bought us seconds," Jerome whispered, still gripping the edge of his console. Seconds are everything, Darius muttered, eyes already scanning the next move. In that narrow window, he reached for the backup transmitter. His fingers flew over the dials as he patched into a private frequency, one he hadn't used in years. The cockpit's background noise faded in his ears, replaced by the static hum of an open line. He took a breath, pressed the mic button, and spoke with the weight of command. "This is Falcon. I need immediate sky clearance over Zone 9. I'm bringing 342 civilians through a war zone." His voice was calm, but underneath it was fire. His hands trembled faintly after he spoke, not from fear, but from the sheer gravity of using that call sign again. Falcon. It wasn't just a name, it was a legacy, and for the first time in years, it echoed again through military frequencies. When enemy jets closed in over restricted airspace, the captain cried out for help, unaware the man sleeping nearby was a trained fighter pilot. If you believe destiny chooses its moment, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. Falcon. You better not be joking. We've scrambled 2 interceptors to meet you at the border. General Ryland's voice cut through the encrypted comms like a lifeline in a storm. In the cockpit, the flickering red lights of the control panel reflected off Darius Kane's steady eyes. His fingers tightened around the throttle as if drawing strength from the grip itself. There was no time to breathe, no room for relief. The window was narrow, 7 minutes, give or take, and the sky behind them wasn't letting go. Victor, seated beside him, exhaled shakily. "They're still on us," he said, glancing at the radar, where the hostile Galdric signatures swarmed like wolves circling prey. "They're not backing down." "They won't," Darius said, voice low, calm but sharp-edged. "Not until they finish what they started." Before Victor could respond, Brannick's voice returned, crackling through the enemy's channel. There was a venom in his tone that sent a chill through the air. "You think someone's coming for you?" Brannick sneered. "You still don't get it. This was never about them. It's about what you know." The words hung in the cockpit like smoke from a smoldering fire. Darius's jaw tightened, a memory rising unbidden. The cold air of a skyborne base, the flickering screen of a classified briefing, and the moment he saw it, video evidence of a Galdric's jet deliberately firing on an unarmed medical aircraft during what was supposed to be a peace exercise. The footage was buried. The report sealed. The operation swept under the rug in the name of diplomacy. But he had never forgotten. Now, Brannick knew. Darius stared straight ahead, the horizon a blur beyond the shaking windshield. His mind raced, not with panic but calculation. If Brannick was here, in this sky, with these jets, then this ambush wasn't an accident. It was a mission to erase the last living witness of Galdric's greatest crime. "How the hell did they know you'd be on this flight?" Victor asked, sweat trailing down his temple. "I don't know," Darius replied, "but it means this isn't just personal. It's a cover-up, and we're all collateral." He didn't wait for debate. With swift, practiced motions, he reached over to the auxiliary panel, bypassed the civilian interface, and activated Victor's comms system. His fingers danced across the console, encrypting and transmitting coordinates, radar logs, and a compressed packet of situational data directly to Skyborne's command core. "If I don't make it, they need to know what happened here," Darius said, more to himself than to anyone else. Outside the cockpit, the Galdric's jets closed in again, tighter now, like predators tightening the noose. One of them dipped low under the belly of the airliner, rising up on the other side, a clear intimidation tactic. Passengers screamed as the enemy fighter's dark gray hull came into view through the side windows. Brannick's voice returned, lower, colder. "You'll never land that plane, Kane." Darius didn't respond. He shifted his grip on the yoke and shoved the throttle forward. "Hold on," he warned, sparing a glance at Victor and Jerome. "We're going full burn." The engines roared in protest as he pushed them to their upper threshold. The commercial jet trembled, not made for this kind of maneuvering, but still holding firm. With the intercept point less than 5 minutes away, he needed every ounce of speed he could squeeze from the aircraft. The airliner surged forward, breaking cloud layers like waves. Wind howled across the fuselage. Behind them, the Galdric's fighters darted like shadows, but they didn't fire. Not yet. They were waiting, for a mistake, for a weakness, for a chance to strike without triggering a global scandal. "They want us scared," Darius muttered, eyes locked on the altimeter. "But fear's not our weight today." Victor looked over. "What is?" "Truth," Darius said. and we're flying straight through their lies. A warning light blinked, a stress alert. The cabin was shaking harder now, oxygen masks hanging, a child crying in the distance, but the passengers had grown quiet. Perhaps they understood that something far bigger than turbulence was gripping this flight. Outside, the sky darkened with fast-moving clouds, blurring the line between heaven and conflict. 2 minutes out, Jerome called. We're close. But the enemy jets didn't slow. One suddenly broke formation and pulled alongside the cockpit. Through the glass, Darius could see Brannick's face, helmeted, unreadable but unmistakably focused. Then Brannick peeled away again. Victor leaned forward. What's he doing? Darius stared ahead, looking for the perfect angle. He wants the last shot he inhaled once, steady and deep, and then began a dangerous maneuver, an altitude oscillation. He shifted the aircraft's pitch up and down in rapid waves, forcing the pursuing jets to constantly recalibrate their locks. It was risky. It increased drag and shook the plane violently, but it made targeting the airliner nearly impossible. The aircraft groaned, its metal frame whining in protest, but it held. Just beyond the front window, a faint flicker broke the clouds. 2 approaching silhouettes, sleek and armed. The skyborne interceptors. Friendly forces. Backup. Darius didn't smile. He didn't relax. Brannick wouldn't run. Not yet, but the first part was done. The evidence had been sent. The truth was in the air now, flying just ahead of the flames. He stared at the sky, feeling every vibration of the metal under his hands, every heartbeat of the passengers behind him, every second that ticked closer to the border. Sometimes, Darius whispered, his voice barely audible beneath the roar of the engines, truth has to be flown straight through enemy skies. They've painted us. We're locked. Victor's voice pierced the tight walls of the cockpit as warning sirens screamed around them. Red lights flashed across every panel, and the threat indicators glowed with relentless urgency. The air inside the cabin turned heavy, charged with panic and pressure. Darius's eyes locked onto the data. 2 enemy Galdrick's jets had locked their fire control radar on the airliner. His knuckles turned white against the yoke as he fought to keep the massive aircraft steady. The shrill beeping intensified. Heat-seeking, Jerome muttered, his voice barely audible over the alarms. Sweat clung to his forehead. We're being targeted by infrared lock. This is not a bluff. Darius didn't respond. His mind moved faster than his hands. He had seen this dance before, but never in a commercial jet with 342 innocent lives behind him. The flashing indicators told a brutal truth. The missile system had them in its grip. But in the chaos, a sudden ping cut through the noise, a clear, rhythmic tone that didn't belong to the enemy. Darius snapped his head toward the radar display. A new signal blinked across the screen. Friendly interceptors, he said, breath catching in his chest. Approaching from the west. Jerome leaned forward, staring in disbelief. They're here, he whispered, as if saying it too loud would break the moment. But the sky had no time for celebration. One of the Galdrick's fighters, sleek and dark against the blue, suddenly broke formation and pulled into a sharp climb. Darius's stomach dropped as a faint trail arced from its underbelly, white smoke curling around a red-hot flame. "Missile!" Victor shouted. "It's tracking us!" Instantly, the autolock klaxon began to screech. The passengers, already panicked from the low-altitude dive minutes earlier, screamed as the entire aircraft lurched. "Hold on!" Darius yelled, slamming the yoke hard left and downward. The airliner groaned in protest, metal stress points pushing beyond their usual tolerance. Trays flew open. Luggage compartments snapped. Oxygen masks dropped like ghostly vines from the ceiling. The wind screamed as the aircraft plunged in a controlled spiral, the earth visible through the left windows and the sky through the right. The missile, hungry for heat, followed. It tore through the air like a phantom, closing the distance within seconds. Come on, Darius muttered, watching the sensors holding the dive. The radar beeped faster. The missile was nearly there. And then a sharp streak passed over the plane's tail, a blur of smoke and light. The missile, fooled by the sudden drop in altitude and heat dispersion, shot past them by mere meters. It vanished into the distance and detonated in the sky with a burst of sound and fire that rocked the aircraft but left it intact. The cabin erupted into a wave of cheers, sobs, and applause. Strangers held each other. One man shouted prayers, another wept against the window. In the cockpit, Jerome exhaled shakily, blinking in disbelief. Victor's hands trembled against the armrests. But Darius didn't celebrate. His hands remained steady. His eyes remained locked on the screen. "Too soon," he whispered, Brannick's still circling. His instincts were correct. A crackle came through the headset, low and sharp. "You never learned to quit, Falcon." Brannick's voice dripped with disdain. The years hadn't softened his edge, if anything, they'd sharpened his obsession. "Then I guess I'll teach you one last lesson." Darius gritted his teeth. His body remained calm, but the tension inside his chest coiled tight. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. He shifted course slightly, adjusting pitch and thrust, bracing for another assault. Then a blur streaked across the windshield, low and fast. A fighter jet. But this one wasn't Galdrick's. It was marked with the blue insignia of Skyborne, sleek, aggressive, and powerful. A second jet followed, weaving through the clouds like a bird of prey. The lead Skyborne jet dove toward Brannick's position and fired 2 bright flares. They burned through the sky like falling stars, interrupting the enemy lock-on attempt. Brannick swerved, clearly caught off guard. His voice snarled over the comms, but no threat followed. Darius, eyes still on the radar, pulled the airliner gently back into level flight. They had cleared the airspace. They had made it. The beeping finally faded. The lights dimmed. The radar showed a clean path ahead. The plane cruised into protected territory, flanked now by allies. Victor slowly turned in his seat, his voice a stunned whisper. "We made it." Darius didn't nod. He just adjusted the heading one last time and stared out into the vast sky. Behind them, the passengers were still cheering, still crying, still alive. And ahead, the battle wasn't over. But this one was. What Brannick didn't expect was that Falcon didn't fly alone anymore. The moment the jet crossed into sovereign airspace, the tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight for too long. The Galdrick's fighters broke off in unison, climbing steeply into the gray cloud cover with one last threatening arc. Their silhouettes disappeared against the sky, but the unease they left behind still hovered in the cabin like a ghost. Inside the cockpit, Darius Kane didn't celebrate. His eyes remained locked on the instrument panel, hands steady on the controls as he guided the airliner into formation with the Skyborne interceptors now flanking them. The radio crackled with military clearance codes and escort directives, but Darius barely registered them. Every ounce of focus went into stabilizing the plane after the chaos. A commercial jet wasn't meant to be flown like a fighter, and now it groaned in protest, its frame pushed beyond design limits. Yet it flew, because he had made it fly. Behind him, the cabin erupted. Cheers burst like applause in a theater after the climax of a film. Passengers unbuckled their belts despite the seatbelt lights still glowing, stumbling into the aisles with shaky legs and tearful relief. Someone shouted, "He saved us!" and others joined in, clapping, some crying openly. Phones emerged like flowers in sunlight, cameras aimed at Darius through the glass divider. "That's the guy. He did it," one man gasped, voice thick with awe. "He's the one who flew us out." Darius exhaled slowly, finally pulling his eyes from the panel. Sweat clung to his jawline, a sheen of tension that hadn't lifted even now. He turned to Captain Victor Ruth, who had remained silent during the final approach, his hands trembling faintly over the throttle. Victor looked at him, a stunned mixture of gratitude and disbelief clouding his eyes. "You just flew a civilian tank through a battlefield," Victor said, his voice raw, like it hadn't been used in hours. Darius gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "Let's land this thing," he said simply. The wheels screamed against the runway minutes later as the airliner touched down. The jolt was hard, but controlled. Outside, red and white lights flashed from emergency vehicles lining the tarmac like a wall of eyes, fire trucks, military jeeps, and Skyborne support crews waiting not with sirens, but with silence. Their engines idled, men in uniform standing at attention, watching as the aircraft slowed to a halt. Victor powered down the engines, his hand hovering over the switches like he wasn't sure if the moment was real. In the background, Jerome Castor, the co-pilot, let out a long, shaky breath and leaned back, blinking up at the ceiling. "I can't believe we made it," he muttered. "I thought we were done." "We would have been," Victor said quietly, "if he hadn't been on board." Darius unbuckled his harness and stood slowly, his muscles aching from the unrelenting pressure of combat maneuvers in a machine not built for war. As he removed the headset, he glanced down at the encrypted transmission unit he'd activated mid-flight. A green confirmation light blinked steadily. The files had gone through. The data, the voice intercepts, the targeting protocols, It had all been sent to Skyborne Command. In the cabin, passengers watched as the door to the cockpit opened. Darius stepped into view, and for a moment, no one moved. Then the applause returned, louder this time. A man in his 60s clutched Darius's hand and said, "You didn't just fly a plane. You flew through death." Another clasped his shoulder, tears in his eyes. "I've got 2 sons. You brought me back to them." Darius didn't speak. He only nodded, the weight of every soul on board pressing deeper into his chest. He wasn't a hero, he was a pilot who had done what had to be done. But he understood now that this flight wasn't just about survival. It had revealed something rotten beneath the surface of international tension, something he had once helped bury. Now it was rising into daylight, and he had brought it there. Outside, the military personnel closed in, signaling for debriefing. Skyborne officers in gray and black uniforms moved with urgency but not panic. They knew who he was, and they knew what this meant. The cover story wouldn't hold. Not after this. Victor stepped beside him one last time before the stairs lowered to the tarmac. "You saved more than lives today," he said, his voice low. "You cracked something open." Darius looked out the narrow window, the sky above now quiet, almost peaceful. His heartbeat was finally slowing, but his mind was racing. He knew what he had sent. He knew what it would expose. And he knew Brannock wasn't finished, but Darius was done hiding. "This time," he muttered, "the cover-up ends in daylight." The moment the wheels screeched to a halt on the tarmac, the steel doors of a nearby hangar slid open with mechanical precision. Within seconds, a squad of uniformed Skyborne agents ascended the stairs of Aryan Flight 672, their boots thudding against the cabin floor. Darius Kane rose slowly from the pilot's seat, his muscles taut, jaw clenched, eyes still locked in the tunnel vision of battle. One of the agents stepped forward, nodding briskly. "Commander Kane, you're coming with us." Now, Darius didn't protest. He handed the controls to Victor, whose hands were still trembling, and followed the agents down the narrow aisle. As he passed the first-class cabin, passengers stood in defiance of protocol, reaching out, grabbing his hand, his arm, offering whispered thanks and tearful stares. A young boy, no older than 6, clutched a plastic wingpin and pressed it into Darius's palm. "You're the real pilot," the boy said softly. Darius paused just long enough to nod. Inside the secure hangar, the air was thick with exhaust fumes and tension. Overhead lights flickered slightly as if echoing the adrenaline still humming through Darius's veins. Waiting at the far end stood General Ryland, stoic, broad-shouldered, with silver streaks in his hair and lines on his face carved from years of war-room decisions. His arms were crossed tightly over his chest, but his eyes, sharp and unreadable, never left Darius. "You shouldn't have been there," Ryland said, his voice like gravel scraped across stone. "But I'm glad you were." Darius stepped forward without hesitation and opened the encrypted briefcase he had carried from the cockpit. Inside were data drives, his headset recorder, and a memory card pulled from the auxiliary panel of the commercial flight. He held them out. "Cockpit footage, comms intercepts, Brannock's voice," Darius said, his voice low but firm. "You're going to want to hear it all." Ryland's expression darkened as he took the materials. Without a word, he handed them to an aide who rushed toward a nearby terminal. The general turned back to Darius. "Brannock wasn't acting alone, was he?" Darius shook his head slowly. "No. He knew I'd be on that flight. This was an ambush. They weren't after the plane. They were after me." Across the airstrip, Victor and Jerome were being ushered into a debriefing room. Both men looked pale, disoriented from the aftermath, but when asked for their statements, they spoke with conviction. "He saved us all," Victor said, voice rough with emotion. "I've flown 20 years. I've never seen anything like it. If he hadn't taken over—" Jerome leaned in. "This wasn't random. Those fighters were dancing around us like it was rehearsed. They weren't intercepting us. They were circling prey. Meanwhile, word of the incident had begun leaking beyond military channels. Journalists, tipped off by airport security chatter, swarmed the outer perimeter. Helicopter blades chopped the air overhead. Cameras mounted on shoulders caught blurry glimpses of Darius being escorted through the hangar's shadowed doorway. Though no one yet knew the full story, the name Darius Kane had already started trending online. Inside, the secured terminal lit up with the first audio recording. Brannock's voice played back, distorted, cold, and unmistakably personal. You should have stayed grounded, Kane. This sky belongs to us now. Ryland's hands balled into fists at his side. This was a sanctioned hit, he muttered, and if Brannick's back in the air, someone high up is still pulling strings. The implications hung heavy. Darius stepped forward. I sent encrypted reports mid-flight, he said. Everything I knew about Galdrich's peacetime violations. Civilian targets. Suppressed data. I buried that information years ago to avoid war. They want to erase it. Now Ryland didn't answer immediately. He stared at the display screens, watching as timestamps, radar logs, and audio files stacked in real time. Behind him, military analysts typed furiously. The silence broke when a junior officer burst into the room. Sir, multiple civilian passengers are refusing transfer until they personally speak with Commander Kane. Ryland looked at Darius, a trace of something like reluctant respect flashing across his face. They want their hero. Darius didn't move. His thoughts were still in the air, his heart still pounding from the high-speed maneuvers, the image of Brannick's insignia still burned behind his eyes. He clenched his fists, then slowly exhaled. I'm not looking for praise. I'm looking for the truth to come out outside. Agents were already reviewing the targeting patterns from the enemy jets. The data matched known formations used by Galdrich's elite squadrons, proving the attack wasn't rogue, but orchestrated. Victor and Jerome's testimonies would soon be forwarded to the Intelligence Tribunal. But Darius's footage, the moment Brannick said his name, was the final blow. Skyborne's internal affairs launched a quiet inquiry. Within hours, they confirmed what Darius suspected. Brannick was part of a buried program sanctioned by Galdrich's intelligence wing, a program tasked with eliminating witnesses tied to peacetime violations during the Shadow War era. Darius, once thought of as a relic of old combat, had just exposed a silent war. The truth spread quickly through Skyborne's ranks. What began as a routine flight had turned into a flashpoint. For Darius, it wasn't about glory or revenge. It was about accountability, about ensuring no civilian plane ever flew blindly into the jaws of a manufactured war again. As dusk fell outside the hangar, the lights above flickered to full strength. Officers moved briskly, screens scrolled with decoded files, and whispers of tribunals and indictments filled the corridors. Ryland finally turned to Darius and said, You may have just started something we can't stop. Darius looked up at the ceiling, the weight of the sky still heavy in his bones. Then let's make sure it ends where it should. Behind him, the faint echoes of reporters shouting questions could be heard, muffled through concrete and steel. But Darius didn't look back. He had walked into the fire once again, not for a medal, not for revenge, but because someone had to. Sometimes survival is just the beginning of the real battle. The tribunal doors closed behind Darius Kane with a low, mechanical thud. No cameras were allowed inside, only stone-faced men in tailored uniforms and tight collars. The long chamber smelled of varnished wood and old responsibility. Overhead, the Skyborne insignia, an eagle piercing a storm cloud, loomed on the far wall like a warning. Darius stood still, his spine straight, eyes calm but alert. He didn't need a uniform to command the room anymore. He had just flown 342 civilians through enemy fire. That was enough. Across from him sat the Skyborne High Council, 5 senior officers, their medals dull in the dim lighting. At the center, High Marshal Ewan Thorne folded his hands. His voice was low but unwavering. You shouldn't have been on that flight, Commander Kane. But you were. And you brought it home. The other councilmen nodded slowly, but their eyes were calculating. They weren't here just to offer praise. They were assessing risk, political, military, personal. Darius had become a symbol, and symbols frightened men who preferred shadows. We're prepared to offer full reinstatement, Thorne continued. Your rank restored, your pension doubled, and a position on the Strategic Flight Advisory Board. Darius didn't speak right away. He glanced to the side where a single monitor replayed radar footage of Flight 672's path through contested skies. The glowing dots, the flares, the dive, the intercept. It looked like data, but he remembered the screams. He took a breath and stepped forward. I appreciate the offer, Marshal, but that's not why I'm here. A flicker of confusion passed across Thorne's face. Then what do you want, Kane? Darius met his gaze squarely. I want a civilian aviation watchdog group formed, independent oversight, not bound by politics or silence, led by pilots, those who've actually touched the sky. The room shifted subtly. One councilman adjusted his jacket. Another leaned back, frowning. They hadn't expected this. "That's unconventional," Thorne replied carefully. "We already have airspace regulators. This would imply that the system failed." "It did," Darius said bluntly. "There were warnings about that corridor." Reports ignored. Civilian flight paths approved without cross-checking military exercises. And now 342 people could have died. His voice was calm, but every word landed like a dropped hammer. Councilman Barron, the youngest among them, cleared his throat. "Even if we agree in principle, the politics—" "Politics nearly got us killed," Darius interrupted. "You can't wait for another tragedy to fix the structure. Flight 672 was a miracle, not a protocol. If I wasn't on that plane, we wouldn't be sitting here." Silence followed. Not denial, just the weight of truth settling in. Thorne looked down for a moment, then back up. "The public is demanding answers. Your name is everywhere, news, terminals, military briefings. Your silence so far has bought us time, but if you go public with this request, it becomes a global issue." Darius nodded once. "Then I'll go public. Either you back this, or you answer for ignoring it." A long pause. Then Thorne exhaled heavily and looked to the others. One by one, they gave reluctant nods. Approval by pressure, but approval nonetheless. "It will be called the Kane Civilian Oversight Division," Thorne said finally. "It will report to no existing agency. You'll have 3 liaison officers, but final authority rests with the advisory panel." Darius didn't smile. He only replied, "Then we have a deal." The meeting ended quietly, but outside the world was anything but. News vans clogged the perimeter gates. Cameras jostled for angles as reporters yelled his name. Darius avoided them all, moving into a black-tinted military transport. Only one stop mattered now. He entered the quiet reception hall of the Emergency Reboarding Center where survivors of Flight 672 were waiting for new flights. But most weren't ready to leave. The moment he stepped through the doors, people stood. Some clapped, others wiped tears. A father stepped forward, holding his young daughter in one arm. "I thought we were gone," the man whispered. "She asked me if we were going to die." And I couldn't say no. Darius looked at the girl. She was maybe 7, clutching a small plush bear. Her eyes met his, wide and curious. "You didn't just fly that plane," the father said. "You gave me back my child." Darius placed a gentle hand on the man's shoulder. No one should have to fear the sky when they're not at war. He didn't stay long, just long enough to shake a few hands, long enough to see what survival really looked like. Back in his quarters, Darius stood by the window as the sun dipped behind the airfield. His skyborne helmet sat quietly on the shelf, its visor scratched, its emblem faded. He didn't need it to remember who he was. The encrypted data he had sent during the flight was already stirring investigations. Internal memos, whistleblower files, layers of hidden decisions that had brought a commercial airliner into a warpath. But the worst was no longer hidden. The truth was in motion now. And so was he. He watched a transport jet rise into the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, Brannick was still circling in shadows. But now, every air corridor was being redrawn, every protocol rechecked, and somewhere down the line, someone like Darius would get to say no before another mistake flew into danger. He turned away from the window, his reflection briefly lingering in the glass, half shadow, half light. The haunting memory of missile locks and Brannick's voice didn't leave Darius, but he found something stronger in its place: resolve. When justice flies with you, the sky doesn't belong to fear. The hangar lights flickered to life as the massive steel doors groaned shut behind them. Dust hung in the air, dancing through the golden shafts of sunlight that pierced through the high windows. Darius Kane walked in silence beside his younger brother, Marcus, whose steps echoed softly against the concrete floor. The air smelled faintly of oil, aged metal and something older, something sacred. Ahead of them stood Falcon 7, fully restored, its frame gleaming under the lights like a slumbering beast reborn. Darius stopped a few paces away, eyes tracing the smooth curves of the combat jet that had once sliced through clouds like thunder. Painted just below the cockpit were 342 tiny white stars, each one perfectly aligned, each one representing a life spared on that haunted flight. He stood still, saying nothing. He didn't need to. The weight of memory pressed down heavier than steel. "You never told me you sent the report," Marcus said, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet but laced with hurt. He didn't look at Darius directly. His gaze was locked on the stars, on the lives Darius had risked everything to protect. Darius exhaled slowly. "I didn't want you in danger," he replied. Marcus nodded faintly, jaw tight. He understood, even if he didn't agree. For years he had begged his brother to leave the sky behind, to stop chasing ghosts in clouds and bury the past. But after what happened on Flight 672, he knew the sky would never truly let Darius go. They stood together for a long while, the silence stretching out like a runway before them. Then a sharp chime echoed from Marcus's tablet. He fumbled to pull it from his tool belt, eyes narrowing as he scanned the incoming transmission. The screen lit up with encrypted data, pulsing with urgency. "Darius." Marcus's voice trembled slightly as he handed the tablet over. Darius took it, his brow furrowing as his eyes darted over the briefing. It was a live alert from Skyborne's military trackers, classified surveillance intercepts, coded flight telemetry, and one chilling confirmation. Brannock was alive. Worse, he had resurfaced near the border colonies, slipping through detection grids and reportedly aligning with rogue militias. But that wasn't the worst part. According to intercepted signals, he was planning a second strike. Not on civilians this time, but on an active military transport carrying classified tech and special operations personnel. Darius didn't speak for a moment. His expression hardened, eyes narrowing into slits of focus. His fingers tapped the screen with practiced calm, expanding the data, cross-referencing the predicted flight path. His silence was louder than any alarm. "He's going after soldiers this time," Marcus whispered. "He's trying to start something bigger." Darius handed the tablet back. "He won't succeed." Marcus looked at him sharply. "You're not thinking of—" "I'm not thinking," Darius cut in, voice low but sharp as a blade. "I know." He turned away from Falcon 7, taking slow, deliberate steps toward a nearby locker. Marcus followed, worry creasing his brow. "Darius, listen, last time, you were lucky. You had airspace clearance, military intercept, people watching your back. But if Brannock's in rogue territory, and you go after him again—" "Then I finish what he started," Darius interrupted, opening the locker. Inside sat his old Skyborne helmet, resting on a velvet cradle. Its surface was dulled by time, the once polished visor now lined with scratches from 100 battles. The Skyborne emblem, an outstretched wing over a rising sun, was faded but unmistakable. Darius lifted it gently, cradling it in his hands like a relic. His reflection stared back at him through the cracked visor, older now, tired, but unbroken. "I thought I left this life," he murmured. "But the sky never really lets you go." Not when there's still something up there worth protecting. Marcus didn't argue. He couldn't. The same instinct that once made Darius Skyborne's best pilot still burned inside him. No amount of time or distance could dull it. In the background, Falcon 7 waited, its engines cold, but its purpose reignited. Darius turned back to his brother, helmet in hand. "Let him try," he said, eyes locked on the runway beyond the hangar doors. "The sky's watching now." Behind him, the faded visor caught the light, just enough to glint like fire. Some men retire. Others return. But the sky never forgets a pilot who flew through fire to bring others home. Seconds later, he stepped forward. The passenger no one noticed took the controls, turning the flight into a mission of survival. If you stand for courage and protecting the innocent, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of hidden potential, racial bias, and the danger of making assumptions based on appearance. Its purpose is to challenge stereotypes, promote respect for individual capability, and inspire empathy, awareness, and appreciation for the unseen strengths in others.